Today, I'm going to do something that I don't think has ever been done on the internet before. I'm going to admit that I have changed my mind about something. I've talked about particular chapters in A Song of Ice and Fire on a few occasions in the past, most notably talking about my favorite chapter in the entire series. But at other points in the past, I've also discussed what I believe to be the worst viewpoint character in the entire series and the worst chapter in the entire series. That being Sir Arys Oakheart and the chapter The Soiled Knight. For those who might not know, Sir Arys is a member of the Kingsguard for Robert Baratheon, Joffrey Baratheon, and Tommen Baratheon, who was dispatched with Myrcella in order to bring her to Dorne and keep her safe while she's there. In the fourth book in the series, A Feast for Crows, he has a single viewpoint chapter entitled The Soiled Knight. It takes place fairly early on, and he dies a few chapters later, making him the shortest lived non-prologue or epilogue viewpoint in the entirety of the series. As I stated, I was not a huge fan of this chapter for a very long time, but on a recent reread of Feast, I've realized a few things that have made me warm to this chapter a bit more. I wouldn't put it among my favorites in the entire series, but I put it pretty far from the bottom in terms of an overall ranking, and today I'm going to explain why that is. So I had two main criticisms, and I've seen these criticisms echoed by others on other places and other forums. Those being, one, that this chapter was pretty pointless, and two, by adding Arys, the story is getting bloated with more viewpoint characters than it can handle. Both of these concerns are pretty fair and pretty applicable to a number of chapters in the series. As the series goes on, Martin has tended to be a bit more long-winded. He often refers to his writing style as a garden, and in doing so, he allows his stories and plots to grow organically, and oftentimes that can result in chapters that maybe he didn't expect to be there initially. This can lead to some meandering elements of the story, and some chapters that are more devoted to world building and general spinning of gears than actual progress of characters or plots, and I did think for a long time that Arys Oakhart's chapter was one of those, but on reread, I realized it really isn't. Rather, it embodies something else that Martin always talks about when discussing his writing. George Martin often utters a familiar refrain, that being that the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. This chapter, The Soiled Knight, is a perfect encapsulation of that prospect. Rather than Arys being this new blank slate point of view character, he's filled with conflict from the jump. He's a stranger in a strange land. He's someone from the Reach who's historically had a lot of tension with the region he's currently residing in, that being Dorne. He is defending Myrcella in this area that is fairly hostile to her, given that the Lannisters were hated to begin with, and after the death of Oberyn, that hatred has increased almost tenfold. And his core conflict in this chapter being the conflict between his vows and his desire to both make a name for himself and to protect Myrcella and live out potentially a life with his paramour, Arianne Martell. The driving action of this chapter is Arianne attempting to convince Arys to aid her plot to crown Myrcella Baratheon as Queen of Westeros. Following Dornish tradition, it would make sense that Myrcella should be queen before her brother Tommen, and Arianne makes the case she's much better suited to the position. Arys generally agrees with this. He stated to love Myrcella like a daughter, and in thinking back to Tommen, he just thinks of this little boy who, as of the last time we saw him, was crying in the courtyards of King's Landing. Myrcella does seem like she'd be a much better queen than Tommen, and Arys is caught between his vows, which are sworn to King Tommen, and Myrcella, who's the person he is sworn to protect. Arianne points out that he swore his vows to Joffrey, not to Tommen, and then brings in discussions of both his affection for her and, additionally, some historical elements. This chapter is also very important to the A Song of Ice and Fire media franchise as a whole in a very unexpected way. Neither of these characters are adopted into Game of Thrones, but this chapter results in House of the Dragon. Let me explain. Prior to The Soiled Knight, the Dance of the Dragons had only been referenced a few times throughout the series. When it was referenced, it was just in reference to a song that talks about a Targaryen brother fighting a Targaryen sister. No other details. However, when we get to A Soiled Knight and Feast for Crows, we see Arianne and Arys discussing Sir Criston Cole, the Kingmaker, and the role he played in the Dance of the Dragons between Aegon II and Rhaenyra Targaryen. Both of these individuals go on to be very important and form the backbone of what is now a House of the Dragon, which is super cool to see. This one-off chapter in Dorne goes on to spawn this entire show, essentially, as this is the first instance of that story really being referenced, and it is used within the story to justify Sir Arys's kind of defection to Arianne to support a cause he believes in rather than being stuck to what he'd oathed to protect. Also, for sake of clarity, since I wasn't sure on this before I started doing research for this video, The Dance of the Dragons is covered by two short stories that are later adapted into Fire and Blood, those being The Princess and the Queen and The Rogue Prince. However, both of these books come out well after Feast for Crows. Feast for Crows comes out in, I believe, 2006, 2005, and these books come out in 2013 and 2014, respectively. So, given that, this truly is the origin point of The Dance of the Dragons and of House of the Dragon as a whole, which is neat. Question of the day as well. In the comments, I'd love to hear who you would add as a one-off, one-chapter viewpoint character if you could add one in the Winds of Winter. My pick would probably be Willis Tyrell, but I'd be really excited to see what other people would think as well. And while you're down there, like, subscribe, that typical YouTube stuff. I'd appreciate it. Additionally, if we're comparing this chapter to others within A Feast for Crows, I do not feel like it is one of the worst on offer. Actually, if we want a bad Dorne chapter, you need to look to the first Dorne chapter, that being the Captain of the Guards. It's the first chapter from Arys Oakhart's perspective, who has kind of the seeds of an interesting character planted for maybe the Winds of Winter, but his first chapter, at least in my opinion, is just bad. It's a new area, so we're really kind of getting into it for the first time, and we're seeing a bunch of characters we've never seen before, like the Sand Snakes and Duran. But overall, it just reads like, oh, we're with this guy Duran. He's the main driving force of the chapter. Maybe it should be his perspective, because the perspective of Arys Oakheart really doesn't offer any thoughts or feelings on its own. That doesn't really seem to be the case later on in the story. Arys Oakheart is very capable of having good chapters, i.e. the Watcher chapter in The Dance with Dragons is fantastic overall. It's one of my favorite chapters in that book. But that aside, I think that that is a far worse chapter than The Soiled Knight, given that The Soiled Knight at least progresses the plot forward a good deal, and I like the perspective of it, where you see the perspective on Dorne from the viewpoint of a King's Landing native and a native of the Reach. So we as the reader are getting acquainted as this character is, and he does have a variety of thoughts and feelings that influence the trajectory of this chapter rather than the camera who rides. With that said, this chapter is not perfect. It does feel a little pointless with Arys Oakhart's death coming a mere one chapter later in terms of the Dorne story, that being a chapter from Arion's perspective, however, who is a much more sensible viewpoint character who does have more emotions than Aryo and more plot relevance than Arys. With that said, I don't think that having him added as a viewpoint character is as much of an issue as I initially thought it was, specifically because the main issue with adding more viewpoint characters is bloat to the story. But given that Arys dies after only one chapter, the story's really not bloated for him. He has one chapter, he will have no more unless he is resurrected or he's worrying Arion or Darkstar or Marcella or somebody. There are also parts of this chapter that aren't the best written. I've seen it criticized for having some cringy descriptions of certain acts that I don't want to detail for sake of monetization of this video. But I overall, A, don't think those are nearly the worst that Martin has done, and B, they're pretty short. It's contained to like 3 paragraphs, and the rest of the chapter around them, particularly afterwards when Arys and Arion are actually discussing the kind of progression of this plot and he's getting slowly roped into it, I think that's a lot better and makes the kind of cringy descriptions early in the chapter fairly worth it. There's also a good amount of setup for future chapters within this one. This is the first time we hear of the Golden Company breaking their contract with Myr, which is a fantastic kind of red flag in that it's the first hint towards the Aegon cause in the entire series, so I count that as a positive for sake of John Connington. Additionally, we get the first references to Quentyn and the fact that he has gone across the sea to Essos posing as a merchant for some reason, that we don't know why that is. I think it also sets Arianna up very well as a very compelling viewpoint character, as we get to see both her struggles and how well she can manipulate the men she's able to ensnare. We get to see Arys really get taken on a ride here and be fully manipulated by Arion in a number of different ways, and it's just pretty fun to see. I also think that being in Arion's head in this chapter might give away too much in terms of the Queenmaker plot and just the broader plot as a whole, so I think having this outside perspective at the very jump is actually quite good. I have referenced Arys Oakheart as my least favorite viewpoint character in the past. He's still pretty low because I don't think he's super important to the story as a whole, but I would not say that The Soiled Knight is my least favorite chapter in the entire series. I'd say it's upper middle, frankly. I quite enjoy it, and I honestly did not expect that at all. Thank you all so much for watching. What do you think of The Soiled Knight? Do you have a least favorite chapter in the series? Is it this one? Is it something else? I'd love to hear in the comments below. While you're down there, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, all the typical YouTube stuff. It's free, it only takes a second, and it really helps me grow the channel and just generally makes me feel good. This is a bit of a shorter and more informal video about just some thoughts I had in rereading this chapter. I'll have more stuff coming for you in the near future, including a ton on House of the Dragon Season 2 when it drops in less than a month. So thank you all so much for joining me, and I will see you in the very near future. Goodbye.